There's a wave across the land. We are moving, moving. It takes one step, it takes your voice, saying, I am not hearing if you are not naming it. I am not stopping if you are not changing it. Here are my hands, let's see what they're making. In the morning, in the rise up, there's a bridge from all that's been in the dawning. The vines are pushing through the pavement. We were born of burning hearts. We are tearing off the reins. From the ground up we will build it. From the clouds above we'll rain it. From the crowd up we will raise it. From the ground up.
I'm Nisha Moodley, and this is Devotion, the podcast about showing up in new ways to weave a new world together. Hello, friends. Welcome to Devotion Podcast, episode 8. In today's episode, I get to share a conversation that I had recently with a friend of mine, Majo Molfino. And I found this conversation so fascinating. In part because I just love digging into people's histories and understanding what brings them to the work that they're doing now, and also just how did they earn the wisdom, that they carry. And Majo is an Argentine-American author, designer, and women's leadership guide. And she recently wrote a book called Break the Good Girl Myth. And what I love that she really shares in this conversation and also in the book is that this book was really written because she herself lived as such a quintessential good girl in her childhood and had to liberate herself from really the trap of patriarchal standards of goodness that are foisted upon us as women. So this is a great conversation, I think. I enjoyed having it. I hope you enjoy listening. Hello, Majo. Welcome.
Thank you, Nisha. Happy to be here.
I'm so happy to be here with you too. Let's start with a couple breaths together. So everyone who's listening, you can breathe with us, and maybe we can start with an exhale first. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I always love to start these conversations by just checking in about where are you in the world right now? What can you share with us about the land on which you stand and your relationship to it?
Yes, I am currently in San Francisco in South Beach, and this land belongs to the Ohlone tribe. So recognizing the Ohlone tribe for the land that we're on and living on today.
Beautiful. And you've been here for a while now in the Bay, back in the Bay for a little while, right?
Yes, I have been in the Bay Area for about 10 years now. Not always San Francisco, but in the general area.
Yeah. And a hot minute in LA.
Yes. And then I dashed down to LA just to try it out. Why not?
Try it. Venice, got that good Venice tug going on.
Exactly.
I'm happy to have you back, even though we don't really get to do all the things like, the deep hangs and the snuggles of pre-COVID times. But I'm happy to know that you're just over the other side of the bridge. So, well, the other question I'd love to open with is probably a really big lead into our conversation, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how you identify and how you feel that your identities have shaped the way that you move in the world and the way that you create and what you create. So, yeah.
Hmm. I love that you asked this question because identity has been something I've grappled with my whole life. I am originally from Argentina in that I was born in Buenos Aires, and my parents are Argentinian and my grandparents are Argentinian. My entire extended family is Argentinian. And so a big part of my identity is being from that country. Yet I grew up in Canada, in Toronto and Montreal. And so, yeah, so I'm also Canadian. And for a long time, I didn't quite feel fully Canadian because my parents didn't speak English, without accents, and it wasn't their first language. And I didn't fully feel Argentinian because whenever I would go back, I people could tell that I had grown up away, and they could hear a little accent in my Spanish, and I even talk about it in my book, Break the Good Girl Myth, particularly when speaking about the myth of perfection. There was a period of time where I lost my native tongue because I was so desiring to get it right. And um, and so language loss has been part of my journey as well. Language loss and then recuperation, which we can talk
Mm.
about. Um, and so there's that, and then I became American to top it all off. And I love that about you too, Nisha, because you're so multicultural and you also have the Canadian American thing going on as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a citizen. I'm not a U.S. citizen. So I've planted roots here, but I'm always like, I could snatch them up at any time.
Exactly. Good for you. Yeah. I remember becoming naturalized when I was 60. Naturalized is a weird word, but becoming
Mm.
a citizen and having to go in at the time Obama was president. I must have been older, but and having to go and swear in and take the test and become quote unquote American. It was a whole process my entire family went through.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. So when you shared about loss of language, do you mean that you completely lost the language or you were just trying to do it? So tell me about that journey a little bit, because that sounds significant, especially if your parents, I imagine, were speaking Spanish at home.
Yeah. So my parents were, it's interesting when back then, especially for immigrant parents and parents in general, there wasn't a lot of information about bilingual, multilingual education, or what I should say is there wasn't a lot of information about what would happen to kids' brains if they tried to retain multiple languages or learn multiple languages at once. And so I think my parents had a little bit of a concern that if I kept speaking Spanish with them, I would somehow not pick up English.
Mm.
But English was happening in school anyways. So, and English is such, I describe it as a quote unquote dominant language. Because conjugation is pretty simple, I think, and so compared to Latin languages, and so I picked it up really quickly. And then when I came home, I started to refuse to speak Spanish with my parents. So they would speak to us, my brother and I, in Spanish, and we would respond in English.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that happened for many years. And they tried to get us to speak Spanish again, but we really refused. And the way I describe it is that I think I just started to feel really embarrassed, and I didn't like how I sounded when I spoke Spanish. I think I didn't think I was good at it anymore. And so it was just kind of like the less I spoke it, the less I wanted to speak it. And it became a cycle. And so I didn't speak it for many years. And then when I was about 12 or 13, I went to an international baccalaureate school where I was able to take Spanish for my second language. And through that training, actually in Quebec, of all places, I recuperated my Spanish, which was in me all along because, I had some recollection of it. And today I can speak it just fine. And I understand it better than I speak it. And it's interesting to go through that process of losing language, because language is what uh, allows us to feel like we belong somewhere. and we belong. It's a signal to us that we belong to a certain tribe or people. And I think what's interesting with the daughters of immigrants and immigrants is, sometimes there are multiple generations in one place, and then there's an immigration, and the new generation is no longer from the original country, and there's a divide that begins, and there was a sense of through language loss, a kind of division between my parents and I. My parents, my brother and I on one side, my parents on the other. Um, and that was interesting.
So that was a really big reclamation for you, it sounds like. And I also know that there was a reclamation for you around your name.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first met you, I don't even know when that was, but some years ago when we first came into each other's fields, I knew you as Maria.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you'd be open to sharing a little bit about that journey with your name.
Sure. So my name in Argentina and Latin America, it's very common to have two-part names, and the first part of two-part names is often Maria. So it's like Maria Celeste, Maria Laura, and I was Maria Jose. That was my name. And in the 80s, apparently it was cool to have like a boy's name for the second part. It was a little
Like
bit more like,
trendy?
it was trendy. Yeah, it was like a little more androgynous or something. Like Maria Jose was kind of cool. Plus, it's the name of both of Jesus's parents. So being from a very Catholic society, it was like Mary Joseph is basically my name.
Right. They were giving you all the blessings.
Yeah,
Your parents.
exactly. And when I moved to Canada, what happened when I was really young is people couldn't say the full thing, and they just started saying Maria, and they dropped the Jose. And I was even teased for having Jose in my name. So I felt some shame around it, like, no way, Jose. Like people would like poke fun at me and say,
Mm.
that's a boy's name, not a girl's name. So I was just kind of like, all right, let me just forget about this second part to my name, tuck it away. And so I went for Maria as Maria for many years, for 30 years, but I never really felt like a Maria. I can't really describe it. I don't quite know why. Because, well, my name isn't Maria; it's Maria Jose, and um, and so then I decided, let me try to see if I can get Americans to say my full name, and that experiment failed pretty quickly. Like it was hard, for people to tag it on. So I just switched everyone over to my nickname, which was my family nickname, which is Majo.
Mm.
Which is taking the MA from Maria, the JO from Jose, and putting it together, which is a common nickname mechanism that people do. I found out in other languages too, not just in Spanish. People do it in Tibet as well. In Tibetan, I found out. Um, and so and so I just decided to go by Majo, and it felt right, and transitioned everybody over. Uh, it's interesting to see, when you change your name, especially after you build a brand, it could be a shock to a lot of people. And then you have to sort of, and there's various degrees of resistance that you get. And I can't even imagine what transgendered people go through, um, you know, when they transition. Yeah, and the resistance that they experience, because even just changing my goddamn name, I had some family members who were still calling me Maria for many months, until they finally came around. Okay, and I get it, because you know somebody for one way for so long, and suddenly they tell you they want to be known in another way, and it's a psychological shift you have to make. So that was an interesting. It was a. I did it because it was felt so intuitive, and like, and that's a trend. I would say that's a common theme in my life, where I jump into the deep end into things, and then I learned to swim. So it was like I woke up, I was like, I'm changing my name to Majo, and I didn't think about how the consequences of that on, you know, my insurance or credit card statements, my, you know, uh, anything. I was just like, I'm doing this. Um, and I feel even though it has had some inconveniences and a little bit of backlash here and there and resistance, it has felt worthwhile to me to own that sense of this feels more like me than that.
Mm. Thank you for sharing this story. And I think it's a really powerful example of how our trying to be so good and not rock the boat, ruffle feathers, make it easier for other people, whatever our good girl proclivities are,
Mm-hmm.
can get what you're offering, I think, is an example of the benefits of doing it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And learning how to swim, after we've jumped. And I want to talk about, this inner good girl, because
Mm-hmm.
you wrote a book, which you mentioned. I'm holding it right now. Break the
Yeah.
Good Girl Myth: How to Dismantle Outdated Rules, Unleash Your Power, and Design a More Purposeful Life. And I would love for you to share, like, where did this book come from? Why did you decide to write this book?
Mm-hmm. I'm that recovering good girl. Like my entire life, I was the one who wanted the straight A's and got the straight A's. I, strive to win the spelling bee, this figure skating contest. I played classical piano. I danced jazz ballet. I took AP classes. I went to whatever the best schools I could go to. I was always the girl that wanted to be the golden child and like repay my parents for their sacrifice of immigrating and prove myself as a minority in a different culture. And it landed me, in a job that I hated in my 20s and in a sort of existential moment of like, what am I here to really do on this planet? So I became really interested in how we're born into certain conditions, rules, messages that form us and layer upon us. And then it's our work to strip away those layers to get to something more essential, something more true and aligned. And sometimes we do that work in our 20s, sometimes we do it much later in life, 30s, 40s, beyond. And so I noticed a pattern in the women in my life, from friends, family members to clients to podcast listeners, that so many of them want to give their gifts, share their gifts, and yet are feeling maybe stuck, blocked, and for various reasons. And so much of it is subconscious stuff that we don't even realize. And one of these subconscious uh, patterns that I've noticed is the good girl and the good girl myths. And so I set out to dive deep into them.
Mm. Have you found, as you've been, you've done obviously a lot of excavation and exploration and interviews. And I mean, it takes a lot to get a book out into the world. And, I know you've been working with women um, for some time. And have you noticed differences? And obviously, I don't expect you to name them all here, but I'm more so curious in a broader sense. Have you noticed differences in how cultures shape the ways that we express or feel pressure to express as good girls? And yeah, I guess like a curiosity that I have is when there's a lot of kind of downward pressure from our culture or our
Mhm.
religion or whatever, how do we even make movement when often I think for a lot of folks that pressure is like everywhere we look,
Yes.
especially if it's in the greater culture or in our religion and our family.
Mhm. Yeah, so one of the things that I argue is the good girl archetype is pretty universal because patriarchy is universal. It's been around for thousands of years. So this is a phenomenon that's cross-cultural and and I see it everywhere. But in cultures where particularly religion and family are extremely at the forefront, like I think of, I'm speaking as a Latina, obviously, and as an immigrant, but as my perspective as a Latina, growing up or having observed Argentinian society is like very Catholic. It's very familial. The gender norms are very important.
Mm.
And women perform certain tasks within families. I'm not saying that it's always like this. And of course, there are exceptions to the rules. And if you go more into Buenos Aires, you're going to get some sort of more progressive liberal hubs. But I'm saying in general, when you have Catholicism has such a stronghold and family structures are so embedded in the way of life, which has an advantage, right? You're going to see a lot of good girl myths, and it's the same for America. I think in places where religion and family are extremely have rules about how a woman should be and should not be. We're going to see more of the good girl myth of harmony, good girl myth of sacrifice. So I guess what I'm saying is, um, these systems exist, across all societies.
Mhm.
and
And
um
inside of us.
and yes,
Yeah.
exactly, and they're inside of us. That's an underlying assumption I make, is like, hey, patriarchy isn't just outside of us, white supremacy is not just outside of us, as we're learning, very much inside of us.
Mm.
As some of us are learning, I should say, very much inside of us. And so, um what's the work that we can do to start unlearning and not defaulting into, unless we want to, unless you make a conscious choice, like, hey, I I know that my purpose and my deepest contribution on the planet is to be a mother and to really uh sacrifice and give in this way. I think that's beautiful. Like, I'm all for that. What I'm really mm, careful of or wondering is when we default into the good girl myths instead of choose them. And when we don't notice we're defaulting into them.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that sometimes I imagine, people might look at this book or this idea and think like, well, the opposite of, being a good girl is being like bad girl. Like
Yeah.
we get to party and we get to buck the system. And I'm like, well, maybe that's part of it. But also I think there are some really, serious implications of kind of being locked in these good girl myths as sort of modes of being or ways of being that aren't, limited to, the colors that we wear, but our expression in a broader sense, in a deeper sense, and even our well-being, our safety. I mean, I wish I had dog-eared the page because now I can't find it, but there was a story that I read in your book of someone who had been misdiagnosed.
Mhm.
And do you remember that story that I'm talking about? And then she was properly diagnosed
Yes.
later.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to share anything that you remember about that story? Because that really struck me as this is a serious implication of being quiet and compliant.
Yeah, you're referring to a story I wrote under the good girl myth of logic, which was a friend told me a story of her sister who was told from multiple doctors that she was suffering from hypochondria because they didn't believe her when she came in and said she was feeling pain and discomfort. And they finally diagnosed her with multiple sclerosis. And I remember my friend telling me, like, my sister could have been diagnosed and treated earlier if they had just believed her. And she lived only an hour away from like the best, most world renowned clinic on treating MS. And my point in saying that is, you know, when we are particularly under the good girl myth of logic and people outside of us don't believe our bodies and we are caught in a cycle of not believing our own bodies, what's the worst that can happen? Pain, and death in some cases, as also uh, we know with Black women and women of color who are going into these medical systems and are being completely disregarded for their pain, particularly in giving childbirth, are more likely to have high blood pressure issues. And so there's also a whole disparity around that we're seeing. And so yeah, what you're bringing up is like these good girl myths aren't just like, oh, like, you know, I didn't get
I
to
want
do
to have
my
more fun.
yeah, I didn't exactly. Or, they really I really tried to share, like, especially at the beginning of each good girl myth chapter, like these are the stakes. Like when we follow the good girl myth of harmony, we give up our voice and truth. And what does that look like for each of us? Here's what it can look like on a small level. Like you're getting a massage and you don't tell the masseuse that that's too much pressure. Like, okay, no big deal. But on a larger level, like you don't speak up in a moment or exert a boundary when you really need to. And there could be lifelong consequences to that. Um, so yes.
Yeah, and in the ways that we be quiet for matters that have to do with ourselves. And then also, I don't want to make that adult feel uncomfortable. So I'm not going to speak up for my child's needs.
Yes.
Or I don't want to make that, police officer feel uncomfortable, but there's something happening over there that is not okay. But I don't know what to do. I don't want to get involved. I'm just going to keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can see like both the personal ways and also the ways that these myths exist inside of our systems. And well, who's going to change the systems?
Mm-hmm.
Guess it's up to us. And so I really see this beautiful, opportunity inside of this book to interrogate where these myths live inside of us. And then as we bust out of them or as we wake up
Mm-hmm.
from the grip of them, that we can really support one another in doing the same, that we can challenge them in conversation and in the world. And then that's how we shift culture.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because the good girl myth of harmony does play out on a collective level. And I think we're seeing how silence is complicit, you know? And I am extremely grateful to our sisters of color and our brown and black sisters who are saying your silence is not working anymore. And I think
And it hasn't been.
and hasn't been for a
Yeah.
long time. And we need to break this good girl myth of harmony. I'm speaking now subset of readers, white readers, if you're listening, or white listeners, if you're listening. We really, and then I'm putting myself in that category as self-identified white woman, really need to break this good girl myth. For not just, it's just like the stake of the women's movement and us being a joint movement
Mm,
is on the line.
mm. Yeah, our entire future.
Mm-hmm.
So the 5 good girl myths: the myth of rules, the myth of perfection, the myth of logic, the myth of harmony, and the myth of sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know what are, and then I want you to dig in with me because you're a little bit of, you are I get to hang out with you and you're a good girl myth oracle of sorts. So I would like to know, and then I'll share too. But I'd like to know what are your main good girl myths that you're kind of jailbreaking yourself out of, and how do they play out in your life, or how have they played out in your life?
Yes. Okay. So my primary good girl myth is the myth of perfection. And this plays out on a daily basis.
Damn it.
Yeah. I mean, there are parts of it that I've gotten over. There are some parts that I've gotten over and some that I'm still working on. And I say gotten over with hesitance because I do think you're constantly chewing on this and we're all in process. But I feel like I have the creative confidence stuff down because I don't mind prototyping, being scrappy with my ideas, putting stuff out there and taking action and looking pretty messy and making mistakes. Like that's that I feel like I've done a lot of work around that, and that's actually one of my like maybe gifts or superpowers. But where the myth of perfection gets me again and again is actually in the achievement side of it, which is I talk about it on page 109, like being such like a good girl achiever and a daughter of immigrants, where I was really raised to sort of work and study a lot. And so my psyche has been engulfed with this idea that if I just work harder and harder and harder, I'll just get further and better. And so I can find myself on that treadmill and uh, approaching burnout if I'm not constantly vigilant about this aspect of my good girl myth. And it's been helpful for me to know that. It's been helpful for me to know that. So I know that I can set, I know that when and how to set work boundaries for myself and how to clear my plate and revisit my plate again and again and be like, okay, what can I eliminate here? What can I, and, and also just observe my desire to put more on my plate because I definitely have that thirst and drive that is endless. And so that's how I see it play out that's how I see my primary good girl myth play out.
Mm. How do you like? What's a clue for you that it's activated? That you're in the myth of perfection. What's one of your personal clues?
Oh, whenever I'm just being very self-critical or unnecessarily hard on myself. And well, let me actually put it this way. When I'm feeling feelings of failure and they are irrational, and I know they're irrational feelings of failure, and irrational in that like I, I feel like I'm failing, but I'm actually doing pretty well, but I feel like I'm failing and I'm constantly feeling a sense of failure. That's when I know that I'm being gripped by the myth of perfection. Like that's my sign.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
Mm. Any other big ones? Any other big myths for you that are kind of
Mhm.
dominant in your life?
My secondary myth is the myth of logic. And it's so interesting. It's taken me a long time to break this good girl myth. And this was the hardest chapter for me to write. It was the hardest one. And I'm still breaking it for sure. Um, I just had really rigorous academic training that like really focused on structure and you can see like even like frameworks, tools, like even the way this book is laid out, it's like very frameworked, right? Which is super amazing because people can like it's practical and people have something to hold on to and they can actually dive in and they have a language and a map to interact with, which is powerful. And at the same time, what I see is underneath the myth of logic is like very messy artistry, like complete, like, you know, just splashing paint on a wall and just rolling around in it kind of thing. So for me, the myth of logic
And
is,
the myth of logic is about choosing logic over intuition, right? That's
yeah,
a big kind of
yeah.
a key to it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
go on.
choosing mind over body and mind over intuition, but it's also choosing left hemispheric types of thinking over right hemispheric types of
Mm.
thinking, which is imagination and well, really it's imagination. And even like, more woo-woo stuff that love like even me calling it woo-woo tells you I have some myth of logic, but embracing the supernatural and uh, s- psychic phenomena, stuff that we don't need proof to know is there. Like some people, like I'm someone who can be extremely skeptical, and I'm like, I won't believe in a spirit unless I see a spirit. And so it's been with the work of certain medicines, actually, I've been able to break through those logical structures and opened my mind to like, oh wow, there is actually a spirit world. Now I can believe it because I've actually seen it with my own
Mm.
eyes.
Well, it's like, I imagine if the myth of logic has a voice, it says something like, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist,
Exactly.
and then you
Yes.
go into it, you're like, oh, well, we just weren't on the right dimension. Like there, enter another dimension and I can see it. I can measure it, and can't actually measure it because it's so vast. But
That's
yeah.
so well put. So well put. That's exactly right. Entered a different dimension and then I was able to see it. And I was able to loosen that myth's grip on my system, which has been powerful. So those are the two that I score really high on, and then I score pretty low on harmony and sacrifice. But sometimes I catch myself, like if I'm doing some self care, I'll be like, wow, and I have a tinge of guilt, feeling of guilt,
Mm.
or feeling like, oh, I'm being selfish for taking this moment for myself. I'm like, where's that coming from? It's a myth of sacrifice still there, echoing in the background. So I think all of us have all 5 good girl myths to varying degrees, but 1 or 2 are pretty persistent.
Mm.
How about you?
What do you think? What do you think? What do you sense my top or some of my big good
Definitely
girl?
no. I can tell you what they're not. You're definitely not a myth of rules because you're an
No.
entrepreneur. You've broken those a long time ago. You're not
By the
harmony.
way, I'm reading what it says on the dust jacket for your book. It says myth of rules, following external rules and authority instead of trusting one's own desires, needs, and opinions. Not really. I'm not big on following authority.
No, you're not big on following
No,
authority at all.
not
Yeah.
really. It's not my thing.
Not your thing. Yeah. I would say not myth of rules and not myth of harmony. And the reason I would say not myth of harmony, but though I do believe you may have had that in your
Oh,
past.
in
And
spades.
yeah, and you had it in spades, but you've broken through it because you were just, I love it so much. Calling out, but like really right, like when the separation at the border happened, I'll never forget it, Nisha. Like you were so vocal and you were so active and you were using your voice, using your platform. At that point, you did not give a shit about whether it was quote unquote on brand. You were just like, people, like, this is what matters the most right now. And you didn't care about how other people were going to receive you or judge you. And I remember seeing that and seeing that. And I want to thank you for that because by example, you were leading, breaking this good girl myth. And even just recently, your post about Trump, So I don't think harmony is yours anymore, at least.
I've had
What
to
would
do
you
a
say?
lot of work on that one.
Mhm.
And still.
Yeah,
Were you
still,
going to
yeah.
say something?
Well, I was gonna say, I don't see logic either. So it's between perfection and sacrifice. So I'm willing to bet you are primary sacrifice and your secondary is perfection. I would
I think
guess.
I think perfection might be my first. But
Oh.
I definitely, so I'll tell you how they manifest for me. So the myth of perfection, right? Demanding perfection in ourselves and others instead of embracing mistakes and the reality of how things are.
Mhm.
Um, for me, that really shows up in my home. So
Mm.
it's the place for a lot of it's easy to, it's a fine line because it's like, is it beauty and creating beauty or is it control issues, right?
Yeah.
Noah would argue that it was control issues. I might argue that it's just beauty
Mhm.
creation. But definitely there's I have a very strong like there's a place for everything and everything in its place kind of thing going
Mm.
on.
Yes.
But also as a child, my parents divorced when I was 3. I'm mixed race. I was very aware of that my whole life. And so there's something I resonate with some of what you shared, even though our experiences, of course, are so different. But just you know, being, who knows if the ambition that I feel is natural, or if it's innate, or
Mhm.
if it's learned, if it's been shaped. But for
Mhm.
me, being really, really good at things, being good at everything that I tried. And then if I wasn't very good at it, I would move along very quickly, find something else that I was good at so that I could excel.
Yes.
And, so one of the ways that myth of perfection shows up is sometimes it can stop me from wanting to just try something, go for it, do it, because I don't know if I'm going to be good yet. And I think that's part of what took me so long to get this podcast out in the world was the myth of perfection was running circles around me.
Yeah.
And, I had a lot of other excuses like, well, I'm a mom and there's so much on my plate. And like, that's all true. But I think really what it was is like, I don't want to make a bad podcast. And I have a feeling, tell me if this is true, but I have a feeling that a lot of myth of perfection people end up having like very refined taste.
Yes,
So
they
like,
do.
I really like good, beautiful fabrics and nice textures, and I can appreciate, symmetry and form, and I love presentation in a meal. I notice these things, and I notice the sound quality of podcasts and the production quality, and so of course I'm like, how am I going to achieve that with my what equipment do I need? I just obsessing about the details. So that's sort of one place where it manifested, but I really, in my life now, see this myth of perfection showing up in, I would say that one place is just when I'm stressed out, I can get really control-y.
Yes.
And I'll get that way, especially with my partner. Where I'm like, it's just if I'm really stressed, it's like I'm annoyed because there's a sock on the floor. Why couldn't you get both of them in the laundry basket?
Yeah.
That kind of nitpicky energy. And sometimes it comes out and sometimes it's just in me like swirling around. So if I notice that I'm starting to get nitpicky about things, which often is just an internal state and sometimes manifests as like, I did that thing I shouldn't have done. I was wrong. Like that self-doubt thing that you didn't call it self-doubt, but that's sort of how I name it. And when I start to notice myself getting nitpicky,
yes,
that is a real sign for me that that's activated, that myth of perfection.
I love that you identified that because it's like, all of the good girl myths and the good girl archetype is really a protective mechanism we develop, a way to cope, a coping strategy we develop to deal with uncertainty, chaos, not feeling safe. And it's like, what's the strategy for approval or coping that we gravitate towards when things are uncertain or a little chaotic? And for some of us, it is perfection. It's moving more towards control. And for some of us, it's really more towards giving and throwing ourselves into a mission or a cause, often at the expense of our own well-being. So just noticing these different patterns and how they play out.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that share.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for, I think it's helpful for me to articulate that because I think that especially, with these patterns that have been habituated over a lifetime, it feels like, well, that's who I am. Who I am is a person who needs everything in order, and it's been interesting for me. I was always the person that like my nail polish would be perfect. And as soon as it wasn't perfect, it came off. There's no chip nail polish happening over here because it's either on point or it's not happening, and it's been interesting to like let my armpit hair grow and let my leg hair grow and stop painting any nails on my body at all. And it's been really, in a way, kind of confronting to that good girl, that that inner perfectionist, to still go to the grocery store with my hairy legs out and notice the ways that then I make myself a little less than and have to be like, oh, this is interesting how I almost feel invisible or something, but really it's like I'm making myself invisible to myself because I haven't fit into some standard of perfection that is polished. And I know that that is some colonial patriarchal bullshit that I'm trying to root out from my system. And
Mhm.
yeah, it runs so deep. But I love that you offer this framework so that we can start to really see how are these things operating inside of us,
Mhm.
probably very similarly from other people, but unique. And it's beautiful because it really brings up a lot of, well, where did this come from, in
Mhm.
our lives and in our cultures and in our lineages and so forth. And, with the harmony thing,
Mhm.
I really, that I think growing up with my parents being divorced, and their divorce
Yes.
was really bad. It was drawn out. It was super nasty. They went to court for custody.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was it was really a rough situation, and I was really aware of that from very young. And then they didn't communicate, and so I was always, and my mom is very open about her struggle with depression throughout her lifetime. And, my dad, I'm quite sure, battled depression as well, at least at some points in his life, or depressive states, anyways. And I was really aware of their emotional states and their disharmony with each other. And so I always wanted to, I never wanted to I never wanted to set them off, which of course is not a child's responsibility, but it's the weight that
Mhm.
we end up carrying.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
and so conflict and confrontation was really scary for me. And it's been a lot of practice and still is a lot of practice to expand my willingness and ability
Mhm.
to allow for that. And now, I sort of have this in the back of my mind, this definition of harmony, which is that harmony is the willingness to be with dissonance. Like
Mm. Mhm.
if I'm willing to be with dissonance, then that's actually like a deeper kind of truer kind of harmony
Yes.
than the sort of
Yes.
shallow, like, let's all get along and everything has to be good and swallow it.
Yes.
You don't like it, push it down. But it's interesting, something that I'm noticing as we're talking is that I imagine like all of these myths in a way, if we're in the grips of this myth of harmony, I bet we create in some ways more conflict, certainly more internal conflict.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I'd love to hear if there's
Mhm.
something you want to share about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed with women who are in context situations with their partners or with their bosses or clients where they hold back their voice, the cost to them is often the price they pay is feeling anger, resentment, bitterness, right? All the stuff that gets unspoken in relationships has to go somewhere. And a term that I write about or write in that chapter is called relationship hygiene. It's like we brush our teeth, we wash our faces, like we need relationship hygiene, which means we actually need to be actively communicating in our relationships and our friendships and our partnerships. And that takes the form of giving feedback. And when we have the myth of harmony, it's like the hardest thing for us to do is to give feedback, right? We often feel like, oh, who am I to give feedback? Or is it now the good time to give feedback? That thing already happened in the past. Like, I don't want to bring it up again. And all the sort of excuses we make. But giving feedback is so imperative to that relationship hygiene, to keeping that relationship fresh, clean, and also allowing it to mature. And I give the example of one client who had a very strong myth of harmony, and she was in a codependent relationship with her partner. And because they were in this relationship where she was giving him a lot of, she was going along with whatever he wanted. So she was helping him a lot with his MBA application and kind of doing whatever he said, but never speaking up for herself. And she did that over multiple months. And then she realized the relationship turned toxic, right? And codependent. And so because she wasn't used to speaking up, it was even hard to have the breakup conversation. Like, I don't want to have the difficult conversation of breaking up because he's gonna get mad, he's gonna cry, he's gonna tell me that, he can't live without me, I'm gonna feel bad. So what did she do? She actually did the most unexpected thing, but when you think about it on a deeper level, it's actually not unexpected. She cheated on him. because that was the way that she could press the escape button to this relationship, right? And like I guess what I'm saying is, when we're in the myth of harmony, our relationships can turn sour to a degree where we are going to find any way to get out, and sometimes the ways that we find are actually I want to say immature, but they're not actually healthy and helpful. And her and I worked together to have her come into obviously self-compassion and self-forgiveness and understand the root of why she had decided to do that, instead of speak up for herself all along in the relationship, but then also have the courage to have the breakup conversation.
Mm. Yeah, it's like the ways that the inner chaos kind of wreaks havoc on our outer world, or the inner lack of integration or wholeness sort of manifests out through our relationships and our choices.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And
Yeah.
something that's coming up as you're sharing is I'm just thinking about this circle that you and I have been in
Mm-hmm.
circle for some time now, and it's been really beautiful to have a space to practice just being real.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about the power of us having those spaces because, we live in a world that reinforces these myths in some ways, that asks us to continue being good in these ways. And I say good in quotations, but basically to maintain the status quo. And for many folks, I imagine like moving out of these is scary or dangerous even. And
Mm-hmm.
how powerful it can be for us to find spaces, form spaces, cultivate them inside of our existing relationships where we can give ourselves more permission to stretch and to build these muscles. So then we can kind of take that out into the world and also have solidarity and community and connection around us as we show up in all the ways.
Mm. I love that so much, and I agree completely. I know so much of your work is sisterhood, and I think going through the good girl myths in sisterhood is really powerful, and being able to hold each other in compassion of like, yeah, these are our shadows, individual and as a group together, and still love each other. And I think that if you're reading the book by yourself, to hold yourself in that compassion. If you're reading it with a sister, if you're forming a book club, to have that spirit of compassion is so important.
Oh, that's awesome to do this as a group, to go
Mhm.
through this book as a group and really, and then have the kind of connection relating in the group to be, like the consent in the group because of the group club to like pattern spot for each other. You're like, oh,
Yes, exactly.
you, there's your myth of logic showing up,
Yes. I love
Very
that.
powerful. I love that. Mm. Well, Maho, I have one last question for you before we go, which is, the name of this podcast is Devotion.
Mm.
And I would love to know, what does devotion mean to you in this moment? And what's a place in your life right now where you are being stretched in your own expression of devotion, where you're being called to show up more?
Mm. Wow, what a beautiful question. What beautiful questions. What am I devoted to in this moment here?
Yeah, or what does it mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
Either.
Hmm. I feel devoted to mm, co-creating a future with hmm, co-creating a future as women alongside men and other genders in a way that's really supporting our planet. So I'm feeling more and more devoted and called to environmental work and justice. I think our connection to nature as women and as people is so important. One of my favorite authors, Charles Eisenstein, talks about this in his book, Climate. How do we come into reanimation, thinking of the world and nature not as a dead thing, but as an alive thing? And it's almost like before we can do regenerative work, we have to do the work of reanimating. And I'm devoted to that.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. That was a beautiful way to complete. I appreciate you so much. I am going to, for everyone listening, I'm going to put the link so that you can get your hands on this amazing book. We'll put that in the show notes. And please get your hands on Break the Good Girl Myth: How to Dismantle Outdated Rules, Unleash Your Power, and Design a More Purposeful Life. Thank you, Majo, for being here today. And thanks for this labor of love that you created.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you for all the work you do as well.
Hey, loves. If you enjoyed this conversation, there is another conversation that I want to point you over to. And that is a dialogue that I had recently with Blair Lindsay for her summit called The Shadow Side of the Feminine. And we had a conversation about community and inclusion. And it was a really beautiful, meandering conversation. At times, we sat in the questions with no answers and kind of dug around in this exploration around community and inclusion. And what does that even mean in these times? We talked about going from the sort of rote masculine feminine dynamics narrative into a more dynamic and fluid way of relating. We talked about some of the shadow that can show up in homogenous or group spaces. And I share a little bit about my evolution in my relationship with harmony inside of community and what I see as true harmony now, which is not just we all get along, and also how to create nurturing and inclusive spaces, which is something that I have been striving to do deeper and deeper over the last decade or so. So you can check that out. I will pop the link in the show notes. And thanks again for being here today. Thank you so much for being here, beloved. I want to extend my heartfelt invitation for you to join our podcast Inner Circle for free at devotionpodcast.com. You'll receive access to show notes and free bonuses, including my favorite guided meditation when you sign up. If you loved this episode, please share it, subscribe, and I'd be so grateful if you would leave a review. Our mixing and sound design is by Lou Janot, brand design by Neverland Studio, episode images by Liv Haddon, and our theme song is From the Ground Up by Ayla Nerio. Thank you all, and thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful, and I'll talk to you soon.
We were born up in a rise. From clouds above we're raining. From the crowd up we were raising. From the ground up we were building. From the clouds above we're raining. From the crowd up we were raising. From the ground up.